Hey, welcome to SI Now. It is Thursday, December 29th, and I'm Maggie Gray. For the last few months, the common sentiment has been that 2016 can't end soon enough. But in the sports world, this may have been the best year in history. For a look back on all the tremendous accomplishments we witnessed, here is the editorial director and managing editor of SI, Chris Stone, and the executive editor, Stephen Cannella. Gentlemen, we have so many amazing moments to choose from. But in terms of champions, Chris, players and teams that raised the trophy, who's the biggest winner of 2016?
Don't we have to say LeBron James? We just selected him sports person of the year. I mean, who else could it be? I would say LeBron, just because of the dramatic arc of his story, you know, coming back to Cleveland, just his attachment to the city. And that's not in any way to dismiss the Chicago Cubs, which you could argue is more historic for certain. But I think LeBron James to come back to Cleveland and then to deliver three of his greatest performances in games 5, 6, and 7 of the finals, that's my choice.
Yes, there's the dramatic arc of his story. There's also the dramatic arc of history, and that's where the Cubs went out. And look, LeBron's our sports person for many, many, many good reasons. But in terms of just a victory, in terms of a franchise finally getting a monkey off its back, it's really hard to get away from the Cubs. I mean, unless you want to talk about Leicester City, then you can really talk about history. But I think what the Cubs were able to do for Chicago, throwing off decades and decades of frustration and just changing the culture of that franchise. It's not something that happened just this year. It's something that Theo Epstein and this regime have done with the Cubs over the last couple of years. But in terms of the biggest, in terms of just a victory, it's pretty hard to underestimate the Cubs, I think.
Fan bases can get very restless. Who do you think is going to be under more pressure in 2017 to repeat what they did, Stephen?
Probably Indians fans. I mean, Indians franchise. Cleveland's gotten the tape. It's Cleveland City of Champions now. They know what this feels like, and they came so close in the World Series. And there are some people in Cleveland who think an Indians win in the World Series would be bigger than what the Cavaliers did, at least in that city. And that's in terms of what that fan base would feel. I feel like there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Indians to go back and try to finish the job that they came oh so close to finishing this year.
But don't you think Cleveland fans felt somewhat liberated by the Cavs' victory? I always remember going into Game 7. You know, they lost 2 straight. They were on the brink of blowing a 3-1 lead, which obviously they ultimately did. But I just felt like among Indians fans at that point, there was this sentiment of like, we're good, you know.
LeBron's in the house. Something. He was at the stadium that night. We're reminded, yes, of the championship that they just won in June. Although I think that may have changed somewhere around the 8th inning. And I think that's when Indians fans really started to believe. Then the rain delay comes, and then history gets written.
I think we're moving on to Buffalo and San Diego and all these other.
Well, don't forget what the Cubs did too. I mean, yes, the Cubs ended that drought, but now you got to do it again. That's the culture we live in. And in Chicago, if they just win once and then go back to another long drought, they're just a team that won a championship. They really have a chance to build something special there, and this is their shot.
They're well positioned to do it too.
Absolutely,
very well positioned to do it for several years to come.
Off the field, 2016 was very memorable as well when it comes to sports. You mentioned LeBron being the sports person of the year. And Chris, a lot of that had to do with, yes, him leading the Cavs to a championship, but also him finding his voice. It seemed like 2016 was a seminal year for athletes speaking out.
Do you want to know a sportsman candidate that I was frequently asked about after we had chosen LeBron? Frequently. Colin Kaepernick. Mm-hmm. And I think that should tell you something about what 2016 was, because Colin Kaepernick right now is the quarterback for a 1-win football team. And yet the people in a year in which we had our deepest roster of sports persons that we can remember, people are saying, should Colin Kaepernick have been the sports person of the year? And that is for just kind of building and generating and shaping a debate that really defined the better half of the second half of 2016.
How is this historic, Steve?
Well, I think it's athletes embracing a role that we haven't seen athletes embrace certainly since the late 1960s, I think. And there were many years, you go back to the famous Michael Jordan quote, not to single him out, but Republicans buy shoes too, and he wasn't going to make any statements that might offend someone for very corporate reasons. He didn't want to damage his brand. I think there are a lot of athletes, starting with Colin Kaepernick. LeBron James did it, in smaller ways. Doug Baldwin has been very active in the Seattle community. There are a lot of guys who are deciding, hey, there's something more important than just my personal brand or my team's brand. And there are other ways that they can even enhance their brand by taking a stand and speaking out and try to have an impact off the field as well.
Where does this go in 2017, Chris? do we see more athletes joining the ranks of a LeBron James or Colin Kaepernick? Or do we see, like oftentimes, then sort of a reversion, or people go back, sort of revert to the mean, so to speak, and maybe shy away from this?
Oh, I don't think we're going back. I mean, do we really think that 2017 is going to be less divisive than 2016?
We can hope.
I think it's shaping up as a very divisive 2017, in which there'll be a lot of voices that will be summoned. You know, a lot of voices that we'll hear in the new year that are going to have, I mean, this is just the beginning of the conversation. It's not like we resolved anything. I mean, you said it yourself. 2016 is the year that athletes found their voice. So what you're saying is the process is really just beginning, and that conversation is really just beginning.
And it's a safer space now for them to do it. Enough of them have come out and sort of got active in these kinds of roles that you're not quite sticking out. And if you're someone like LeBron James and you want to wear a safety pin on the cover of your Sports Person of the Year issue, there's going to be less of that backlash, even in your own locker room, than maybe there used to be. I think we're going to definitely see more of this.
Really looking forward to 2017. You gentlemen stick around, though, for just one moment. There are more year-ender conversations that we need to have. But first, one of the men who led the way as an activist and agent of change was, of course, the late, great Muhammad Ali. Ali was on 40 SI covers, and so many of his iconic photos were shot by award-winning photographer Neil Leifer. Leifer reflected on the passing of his lifelong friend back in June.
Well, there were two sides to Ali, and I'm sure Tim and Steve would agree with me. One was what he did to promote the fight and how he was privately. I was fortunate enough to see him once or twice privately. For example, the best example I can give you is he and Fraser publicly were at war. He promoted, and Fraser didn't always appreciate that. I think Ali was too quick for him, and Fraser sometimes felt that Ali went a little too far. But I did a cover for Sports Illustrated previewing the Thriller of Manila, and I had Don King, Ali, and Fraser, and I wouldn't permit anybody else in the studio, the entourages, because the minute Ali had an audience of one, he had to entertain. Well, I remember as I was changing film, whenever there was Muhammad and Joe were talking about their kids, there was none of what you saw publicly. So I think there were two Alis, and one, he knew how to promote himself. The minute there was an audience, he was very different. And with another fighter or with another writer or anybody, if you wrote a lousy piece about him, or at least a piece he thought was lousy, publicly, in front of other writers, he would get on your case. Privately, he would he couldn't understand why would you write anything bad about him.
Chris and Stephen, 2016 will also be remembered as the year of so many retirements. We saw so many superstars walking away from their respective fields. Chris, who are you going to miss the most?
Poppy.
Aww.
You and Major League Baseball will miss him the most.
Well, I think a lot of us will miss him for a number of reasons, but I think it's always hard to see. Listen, full disclosure, lifelong Sox fan. You know, I've been able to temper that in my professional capacity.
Okay.
I promise you.
Have you?
But I think it's really hard to see an athlete go out at the top of their game, because when you saw the way he performed this year, you can't help but think that he would basically be the same player next year. And but I didn't see Jim Brown play. You know, he went out at the top of his game. I saw Barry Sanders go out at the top of his game. It's like, but you know, when you know somebody has so much left to give, you hate to see them leave early. But also, I think baseball really needs a guy like David Ortiz, because if you were to build a commercial, like a national campaign around a baseball player, who would you choose ahead of David Ortiz at this point? I mean, Mike Trout clearly is a once-in-a-generation player, but he doesn't have that charisma or visibility. And that's what baseball's struggling with a little bit right now, is finding those athletes. You know, basketball certainly has it. The NFL has it, but baseball's struggling to find that, and Poppy gave that to them.
Chris, just following up, do you think that David Ortiz regrets announcing that he was going to retire before 2016 because he really didn't leave the door open for himself to return.
We saw him the other night. He seemed pretty happy to
Yeah.
me.
Okay.
Poppy's good.
Yeah, life is good for Big Poppy.
Let's not forget he's also an excellent magazine editor, too. He took over an issue of SI
did.
in early
So he did.
October. He has a job in retirement waiting for him if he wants it.
A second career right up
Exactly.
the ladder, too. That's impressive. Who are you going to miss the most?
You know, I'm going to miss Ortiz. Definitely, I'm going to miss Vin Scully, and definitely the voice of baseball. But you talk about people going out at the top of their game. Michael Phelps, if he wasn't at the top of his game, he was really, really close. 5 gold medals. Now, there are 2 ways you can look at this argument. What more does he have to prove? What more does he have to accomplish? 28 career Olympic medals. On the other hand, I'm curious to know what this guy could keep doing if he kept at it for another 4 years or another 8 years. He still is the best swimmer in the world. It's really impressive what he was able to do this year, and we know what he's been through over the last couple of years. But I think one of the reasons why he seemed to enjoy his Olympic experience so much, it gets back to what you talked about Ortiz announcing early. I think Ortiz and maybe Phelps to some extent, knowing that this was his last Olympics, they were both kind of liberated knowing this is their last rodeo. They could enjoy the ride. Michael Phelps has talked a lot about how he didn't really enjoy his 2012 Olympic experience and he wanted one more taste. I think soaking up the moment, knowing this is it, pouring everything you have into one last go at it, that might be one reason why Ortiz and Phelps had so much success, but also it makes it really bittersweet to see them go because you realize, wow, if they'd enjoyed every moment like this, their careers might have been even better than they were.
Let me give you a few names of the people we saw hanging up. Peyton Manning, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Vin Scully, as you mentioned, Kobe Bryant, Phelps, you mentioned, David Ortiz, Abby Wambach. If you were going to pick one of those athletes to make a comeback in 2017, is there anyone on that list that you think may actually come back?
Big Poppy. Why not? I mean,
Led the league in doubles last year.
Roger Clemens, he doesn't have to bother with spring training anymore. He stays in shape. He comes back, mid-season.
Steinbrenner's box. Not this time.
Not this time.
I'm guessing Duncan could still play if he had to as well. And something tells me Pop would welcome him back, I'm guessing.
I was hoping for Kobe.
I don't know that they
think so.
need Tim Duncan at this point.
True.
I don't know if the Red Sox still need David Ortiz as much as they do.
Red Sox need Ortiz more than the Spurs will need Tim Duncan, I think.
Gentlemen, thank you so much, Chris and Steve. Have a happy new year.
You too.
Really appreciate it.
Happy
2016 was definitely one for the ages. Hopefully 2017 will be just as amazing. Okay, one word to describe 2016. You've heard it already. Divisive. And we're not just talking about fan allegiances. No, what we saw in sports all year long may have foreshadowed the outcome in November. You know what I'm talking about. Here's our own John Wertheim with more.
This was a year with a prolonged knockdown dragout, an extended pennant race you might call it. Regardless of what side you supported, where your rooting interest resided, you were on the edge of your seat. This great race triggered rallies and filled arenas, and it had little to do with sports. As the ratings made clear, who had time for the NFL when we had this other battle going on? And the final score, Trump 306, Clinton 232, will go down as an all-time upset. And yet, if we had looked to sports and not the pollsters, maybe we would have seen this result coming. See, in 2016, sports offered relics from the 80s, making return appearances. A man we've known for decades took on a new role and fashioned one great last act. We had hardworking men in the Midwest, tired of feeling ignored by the chattering class, taking down the coastal elite. We saw Americans consider an intriguing option and switch their loyalties unexpectedly. We saw the U.S. reestablish its place in the global community. There was plenty of scandal and controversy along the way, but that didn't really seem to derail much momentum or turn people off. Maybe the biggest omen of them all, less than a week before Trump's historic win, we had this bit of unlikely history. And it was made, in Ohio, after returning from what was thought to be an insurmountable deficit. The critical difference between government and sports? Sports, we know, will be made great again in 2017. They always are. In this year of division, maybe we can unite in that.
Now it's time for our SI Now full-on feature countdown to the new year. In no particular order of greatness, of course, because, well, we like them all. Here's our second favorite feature of 2016. Of course, the social norms in this country are changing with every election. The legalization of marijuana is a hot-button issue across the country. This past year, we saw the biggest push yet by former NFL players for cannabis to be accepted by the league as a pain management tool. One of the most outspoken believers in the drug, Jim McMahon, sat down with me to talk about how cannabis may have saved his life.
Charles Martin took the shot at McMahon well after the ball was thrown and slammed him to the turf.
Jim, let's start here. At the end of your football career, can you describe the amount of pain that you were playing with on a weekly basis?
I've had 18 surgeries, so tore half my kidney off, kept playing. I was in pain pretty much my whole career, and then after my career, I was still eating painkillers for about 5 years, and I knew I had to get off those. They were just ruining my insides. I used to go months without leaving my room, just sit in a dark room and watch the ceiling fan go around. My head was hurting so bad that I didn't know what I was supposed to, I couldn't remember things. I couldn't really function. I didn't talk well. After games, you would get on the plane and here come the trainer with whatever, what hurts, here, take this. You already had your beer sitting there. But that's the nature of that game. You get them back in as quick as you can. Back when I played, it was like, can you follow my finger? All right, you're back in.
There have been a few people who have predicted almost the demise of football. If there was a test for CTE in the living, how do you think that would affect the sport of football?
When you're playing and you've got pain in your knees or your shoulder, your brain can overcome that, you're with adrenaline and stuff like that. But when it's your brain that's affected, you don't know which way to turn. That's why these guys kill themselves. I talked to Dave Duerson before he did that. Andre Waters killed himself. There's been a few others. And it's just, they get to the point where they're so frustrated because they don't know what to do. I was in the same boat. If I had a gun, I wouldn't be here. When you're taking all these pain pills, I couldn't sleep when I took them. I'd eat probably 8 to 10 a day of Percocet and I couldn't sleep. The only thing that helped me sleep was marijuana. So I've been using it for a long time.
When Roger Goodell says the reason why marijuana is still on the banned substance list for players now, he says their marijuana policy has the best interest of the players in mind.
No, that's BS.
Why is that?
Because they want you taking their pills. I think they're in cahoots with Big Pharma. My whole career they were pushing pills on you. For whatever ailment you had, they had a pill for it. And that's the reason that they're demonizing this plant the way they are. Because you wouldn't have these problems with these guys with all their head injuries and these kind of things. They're, the joints and stuff like that. This stuff's so much better for you. There's no side effects. It doesn't kill anybody. There's no documented cases of people dying, but there's hundreds of thousands of people die every year from these pills. And all they do is take them off the market. Pharma doesn't get a slap on the wrist, nothing, for killing all these people. These doctors figured out here in New York what was causing my problem. He told me I had a broken neck at some point in my career nobody told me about. So I have a blockage at C6 and 7, and then my C1 and 2 were twisted 25 degrees. So it was literally choking off my spinal fluid. And these guys figured out a way to move those bones to let that fluid out and give me some relief, because your head fills up with all that spinal fluid. It's not fun. I mentioned this to Roger Goodell and the Players Association. You should have these guys tested every year. Have a picture, an MRI done to their necks and their heads to see if everything's in alignment. I'm not trying to get rid of football. I just want people to get diagnosed properly. And that's still not happening, obviously.
How does that make you feel to know that, and perhaps to know that there are football players being put in harm's way?
Well, we've known it for years, as have they. They're just like big tobacco was back in the day. They denied. Now the NFL is doing the same thing, but thank God somebody spoke up, and they know there's a link between CTE and traumatic brain injury. I'm tired of these guys killing themselves and seeing these guys in such poor shape because they're not diagnosed properly. we're headed in the right direction. We just, like I said, if we can get guys diagnosed properly, a lot of these problems down the line won't come to fruition. There's still going to be injuries. I mean, the game's a violent game, and injuries are all part of that. We all knew we'd have bad knees, bad arms, and shoulders and stuff like that, but nobody ever mentioned the brain. Nobody. And now that this has all come to light, I mean, it's scary. My head hurts so bad, but now at least I know there's hope, and that's what these guys didn't have because they weren't diagnosed properly.
Very interesting stuff. And that's going to do it for this Thursday episode of SI Now. We'll see you back here tomorrow with Super Bowl champion Chris Canty and Super Bowl III MVP, the one and only Joe Namath. It all happens at 1 p.m. Eastern. But until then, stick with SI.com and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at SI Now Live. We leave you today with a look back at those that we lost in 2016.